evening and welcome again to the Weinberg. We're delighted that you're here. You're in for a real treat. I'm Ron Volpe, the president at Hood College, and Elizabeth Cromwell will be speaking with you very shortly. Some years ago, a group of community leaders and individuals and organizations met and talked and thought and dreamed and envisioned Frederick Reads. And now today, in our 7th year, the Frederick Reads program is indeed a model, a template for other cities around the country. And that development is a real tribute to this community, to the many individuals and organizations and institutions and foundations in and around the Frederick area that joined together to make this Frederick Reads program very possible. Many were involved, and I believe the centerpiece of this certainly was the Frederick County Public Libraries. They were major players from the beginning, and we want to acknowledge the leadership there of Daryl Batson, the executive director of our public libraries, not only for helping in the Frederick Reads program, but for the work and service that the library does for this community. We appreciate that very much. Hood College has been a proud partner of Frederick Reads for many years, from our board of trustees to our administrators, faculty, staff. We've been very supportive of the program, and we indeed are very proud to underwrite tonight's program. The reason we are able to do that, of course, is because of some funding from the Hood College Center for Humanities and Colloquium, also from the Wilbert and Wilma Haynes Biomedical Lecture, and most specifically from the Hansen Fund. Carol Hansen was a graduate of Hood College. Her husband Robert was a graduate of Gettysburg, and together they formed this fund to enhance the learning at Hood and Gettysburg College. And tonight we're pleased to have many students from Hood and students from Gettysburg College. The fund is administered by the Foundation for Enhancing Communities out of Harrisburg. They have been a wonderful supporter of the Frederick Reads program, and the president and CEO of that foundation is with us tonight, and I'd like to acknowledge her and ask her to stand up. Would you please acknowledge Janice Black, the president of the foundation? Thank you, Janice, for all you do and all you continue to do for this program. Of course, this program doesn't just happen. It takes a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of volunteers, a lot of individuals working a long time. And on the back cover of your program, you will see the Frederick Reads Committee, and I'd urge you to take a look at that. And we're so grateful to all of those individuals that work tirelessly in the trenches. And of course, it's held together by one individual, and that's the chair. You might say we have the worker bees, and then we have the queen bee. And it's my privilege to present the chair of Frederick Reads, Elizabeth Cromwell, who also answers to Queen Elizabeth.
Well, thank you for that introduction. On behalf of the entire committee for Frederick Reads, which is a very large and dedicated group of individuals, I'd like to welcome you to the 7th annual Frederick Reads celebration. I know you're eagerly awaiting an interesting evening of discussion, including a few audience questions, followed by a book signing in the lobby. Frederick Reads has dozens of partners, and one of our largest is Hood College, and I would like to thank President Volpe for his steadfast support of the program. One other person at Hood that I would like to recognize as well is Professor Rebecca Prime, who I can't see, but she's over here somewhere, and she coordinates the Hood Center for the Humanities Colloquium, and I've been collaborating with her for many months on this event. Both Hood and the greater Frederick community benefit tremendously through this innovative partnership. Thanks to all the people and organizations who support Frederick Reads through contributions so that we can continue to bring world-class authors to Frederick at no charge to our audiences. Please join me in acknowledging the generosity of our friends and neighbors, many of whom are in this room as we speak. Tonight, we are fortunate to have two prominent authors on stage. Rebecca Skloot is the author of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which has been one of the most frequently requested selections for Frederick Reads from our audience. And I assure you, those surveys that you fill out really do work, so please make sure that you turn them in. The book tells a riveting story of the collision between ethics, race, and medicine, of scientific discovery and faith healing, and of a daughter consumed with questions about the mother she never knew. Ms. Skloot will be interviewed on stage tonight by award-winning journalist and author Michelle Norris, host of NPR's All Things Considered and one of the most respected voices in American journalism. Norris has interviewed world leaders, Nobel laureates, Oscar winners, presidents, military leaders, influential newsmakers, and even astronauts traveling in outer space. In 2010, Norris's book, The Grace of Silence, was published, in which she unearthed long-hidden family secrets that raise questions about her racial legacy and shed new light on America's complicated racial history. Please join me in giving a warm Frederick Reads welcome to Rebecca Skloot and Michelle Norris.
Good evening, everyone. You are in for a special treat. This is a real honor for me because Rebecca is, you heard all the wonderful things about her work. She's also a wonderful woman and a dear friend. So for me, this feels like Rebecca's in my living room. And we have a chance to just have a wonderful chat. Now, you're here on April 19th, and you're here in Frederick. And before we came out on stage, I learned that this is an important place and an important date. So before we dive into talking about your book, tell us about the sort of kismet of this date and this moment for you.
Yes, so today, while I was on my way here, my dad called. My father is a poet and a fiction writer, and he called and he said, "You're going to Frederick to speak at, and you're going to be speaking at Hood College," which I'm doing in the morning, as well as to a lot of students here today. And I said, yes, and he was like, I've been sitting here thinking, like, April 19th, Hood College, something is happening on that day, and he's been writing an essay about one of the most formative experiences he had as a writer, and that was that he went to Franklin and Marshall College, which is not terribly far from here, and it was an all-boys school at that time, and Hood College was the closest all-girls college. So the boys at Franklin and Marshall were always up for going to events at Hood College, but on April 19th, exactly 48 years ago, Anne Sexton, the poet, spoke here. And my father was the only man who he drove down with one of his female professors to see Anne Sexton speak. And he's been working on an essay for quite a while about how that completely transformed his life, of being in the room with her, hearing her talk, and what that did to him as a budding poet. And so he called me literally about an hour ago and was like, "This is the same day. You're going to speak at the same school where I went and had my life changed by Anne Sexton." So Kismet, Henrietta, whatever it is, I'm really glad to be here on this day.
That was Anne Sexton.
Yes,
That was a punctuation mark provided by Anne Sexton. Many people may know this if they've read your book, if they've read about your book, but this was a labor of love, and it took you a long time. If someone takes 3 or 4 years to work on a book, that feels like a long time. This was more than a decade in the making. You are a young woman, so you have dedicated a considerable amount of your life to this book. I want to take you back to the beginning. When did you first hear about HeLa cells and about the woman behind HeLa cells, Henrietta Lacks?
Well, I first heard about her and the cells when I was 16 in a basic biology class. This was 1988, so you can all do the math and figure out how old I am. And my biology teacher said what all teachers say at some point in a science class, which is there are these amazing cells, and they've been alive since the 50s, even though the woman they came from died. And he wrote her name in big letters on the board, Henrietta Lacks, and then he turned around and said she was a black woman, and that was it. And class was over, he erased the board, and I went up to him afterwards, and I was like, well, who was she, and what else do we know about her, and did she have any kids, and what do they think about these cells? And he just said, sorry, nobody knows anything. And
you were 16.
I was 16, yeah, and I was taking a class at a community college to make up for high school credits because I had failed biology at the local high school. So I was not exactly your stellar biology student at this point. And he said to me, if you're curious about this, go see if you can find something about her. Write up a little thing, I'll give you some extra credit. And so I didn't. I went home, I looked at my parents' encyclopedia, there was nothing about Henrietta there, and that was sort of it. Because I wasn't planning to be a writer, I was planning to be a veterinarian. But it stuck, and I just was obsessed with these cells and this question of who she was and what her family thought about it all. And it wasn't until another 10 years later that I started thinking about writing about her. But in that time period, I was just constantly thinking about her. And eventually, when I actually did write the book and I finished the manuscript, I tracked down that teacher who had long since retired, and I sent him a copy of the manuscript with a little note that said, "Dear Mr. Deffler, here's my extra credit paper." It's about 23 years late, but I have a really good excuse. It was hard to find anything. And he was completely shocked. He did not remember me at all. I was in one of these biology classes that was a huge auditorium with hundreds of students. He was pretty close to retirement at that point. He had been teaching this class for years and years, saying the same thing. And his response was amazing, and I like to talk about it when there are students and teachers in the room because I think it's really important in terms of education. He said, this is why you keep teaching, because you never know what one sentence you're going to say in a classroom is going to totally change somebody's life and what they might do with it and how that might change other people's lives, even if they don't know it at the time. And I can guarantee you I probably looked like I was sleeping. I probably was one of those students who didn't seem like she was particularly involved in the moment. But it did. It was just one little sentence in a classroom that just stuck with me the rest of my life and led to this.
Did he send back your manuscript with a grade on it?
No, he didn't. I didn't ever ask for a grade. We're actually doing an event together in Portland next month, which we've never done before. We're going to get up on stage and do a conversation, and I'll have to ask him what my grade would be. I think it'd probably be. The funny thing is what he did say, so he's in the beginning of the book. One of the opening scenes is my teacher, who is a gnomish balding man, is how I described him. And I went and, when I saw him for the first time since I was 16, about a year ago in Portland, he came walking up to me where we were supposed to meet, and he said, "Hello, I'm the gnomish balding man." So I don't know how he would grade that particular line, but the rest of it he was very, very happy about.
It's the way that you open the book in telling this story. I just wonder what it's like for you now when you go to some sort of entry about Henrietta Lacks, because she was little more than a footnote. And if you Google her now, there's all kinds of information, and there's all kinds of citations. We know a lot more about her now. What is that like for you to have you done that yourself, and the personal satisfaction that comes from filling in the blanks in that history?
I think that I haven't, in some ways, the book came out, so I worked on it for over a decade, and then the book came out 2 years ago, and it's just been this whirlwind ever since. It just sort of exploded the moment it came out, and I've been traveling and talking, and I think we were sort of talking a little bit about this backstage, that I haven't, in some ways, I think a lot of it hasn't even sunk in, what's actually happened with the book. I feel like I kind of need to go sit in a little room by myself for maybe a month and be like, wow, what just happened? Because it has been so amazing to watch the response that people have had to the story, their responses to the family, and the fact that now, there's Henrietta Lacks is very much, concreted in the historic record. There are now bills in Congress, sort of with her name in them, and there are historic landmarkers, and there's, so it's
There will probably be a building in her honor.
At some point,
discussion about
well, there's
that.
actually a high school that's just being, the ribbon cutting is in a few weeks. It's a science and technology high school. It's the Henrietta Lacks Memorial High School in Vancouver, Washington, which is really exciting. And yeah, so there's all these things, and I think, honestly, I'm still at the point where my reaction is like, whew, like it worked. Because when you're a writer, I know so many people who spent a decade or more working on incredible books that were really important that just didn't take off for some reason or another, that depending on what day they're published or, what happens in the news at a certain time. You just never know what's going to happen with a book. And I always knew that there was a chance that no one would even hear about the book or read it. And I didn't want that to be the case. So I think there's a side of me that's just starting to register that didn't happen.
What kept you going during those 12 years?
I think a lot of different things. One of them is that I'm just sort of very hard-headed. And Deborah is as well. Deborah Lax, Henrietta's daughter. And one of the biggest hurdles that I faced when I was writing the book really was her. I mean, she wouldn't talk to me for over a year and a half.
Can we back up there?
Yeah.
Because I wanted to dig into that a little bit. That's one, as a reporter, I understand that moment where you have to approach someone who has information that you need and they don't want to give that information up. And in this case, it's overlaid with all kinds of, emotional complications. You're asking about a mother that she never really knew and that she's never really had a chance, to say a proper goodbye. There are issues of class and race and all kinds of suspicions. So, if you could just sort of back up a little bit and talk about how you decided to make that approach, because you knew in order to that was the portal that you had to go through.
Right. No, I knew that I needed to get her family to talk to me, and what I didn't know was anything that had happened to them. So I came to the story thinking, I'm going to write a book about this amazing woman and her amazing cells, period. And when I called Deborah, I was a 20-something-year-old graduate student at that point. I really didn't know what I was doing as a journalist. Some of the first interviews I ever did were for this book. I had a biology degree. I'd never taken any journalism classes. So I wasn't trained as a professional journalist at that point. And so when I called Deborah, and our first conversation was just this sort of overwhelming brain dump coming from Deborah, where she was so excited about the idea of someone writing a book about her mother because she wanted the world to know who she was. And she also said, maybe then I can figure out who my mother was, because she was so young when she died. She didn't remember her. And maybe I can understand what these cells are. And then she also said, but I don't know who to trust, and how do I know you're not coming to try to steal my cells? And she just let out these bits and pieces, and somebody murdered somebody, and somebody stole somebody's medical records, and it was all totally confusing to me. But the one clear thing I got from it was she's scared, and she obviously has a reason to be, and I have to figure out what happened, why she's reacting this way to me. And that was the moment where I realized that the story wasn't just about Henrietta and the cells, but that there was some other story that I didn't know about, which eventually I came to find out was, her children were also used in research. For those who haven't read the book, the family didn't know about these cells until 25 years after Henrietta died, when scientists came back to them to do research on the children to learn more about the cells. And they didn't get permission to do that. And it was really traumatizing for the family. Their medical records were released to the press and published without their consent at various points. I mean, the number of things that had happened to the family before I came along were sort of astonishing, and I didn't know what they were. And so then as I started trying to fill in the story and understand why she didn't want to talk to me, I quickly realized that really I was another person coming along wanting something from them, that their whole lives had been these stories of people coming along wanting things having to do with these cells, particularly white people, and that it had never worked out very well for them. And so I think, Deborah not talking to me and pushing me away the way that she did. She didn't just say, I'm not talking to you. She said, I want to talk to you. I really want to talk to you. I'm terrified to talk to you. And that's different. That's like, there was a reason for me to keep going at that point, because I knew there was something there and that she really did want to talk. And so then the more I understood about the family's story, I think the more she was able to trust me, because I started to see how I fit into their narrative in a way that I didn't when I first called. So I think it was essential that she not talk to me for that long, because I needed to figure out why.
Did you also have to win the trust of the medical community? Were they equally suspicious of you?
No, not really. And which is an interesting sort of part of the whole story, that, for the scientists involved, I mean, I think the general public often assumes that maybe this is a story people didn't want out there, that this makes scientists look bad, and that they would feel like they've been outed about something. And that's not the case at all. I mean, science is very much about putting information out there, and learning from the facts and revising your opinions about, how things work based on information. And for most of the scientists that I talked to, they were trained, and if they learned about HeLa cells, the woman HeLa cells came from, they learned it was Helen Lane, this woman who was usually a white woman. And as I went out and talked to scientists about it, their response was like, well, our textbook said it was Helen Lane, you need to fix that. And that's what science is about. It's like fixing the record once you've discovered
Sticking
something
to the
new.
facts.
Yeah, and so there was never any sort of, we need to hide this. The people who were involved in the story were very open to talking to me and to, learning about what the family's response to the cells was. They didn't know. The scientists who had done research on her children, when I came along 2 decades later, still didn't know that the family hadn't realized what was going on. They still didn't even realize the family.
And I thought that was so
consent.
curious. I mean, how is it that they didn't know that?
Well, they weren't talking to them. They weren't listening to them. They weren't there was just not a lot of communication there. And I think when you start talking about whether the scientists are open to talking to me, this is actually one of the big lessons for me in writing this book. Deborah used to, once she sort of trusted me and we were working on, we were sort of doing this book, she said she would get slack for talking to a white writer. Like some of her, neighbors or people in her community would say, why are you talking to a white writer about this? You should be talking to a black writer. It's a black story. And first she would say, no black writers asked me to do this. And then second, she would say to them, I don't think a black writer could write the story. And she would say this to me, and I would say, that's ridiculous. We are so beyond that. Like, this is, of course a black writer could write this story. And she said, no, I don't think a black writer could get the access that you can get. And I said, no, that's ridiculous. And then there was a point where I was actually interviewing the scientists who did research on her children. And I had this moment where he was talking to me and he referred to the family as those people. And he did it in a way that I just suddenly, it hit me that had I been a black reporter sitting there, he wouldn't have been so open with me. He would have been very defensive. This was a scientist who was raised during the era of segregation. He was working in hospitals that were, the colored ward was here. And, and I think when you ask why they didn't talk to the family and communicate with them, these guys weren't scientists who were trained to talk to black people, really. I think, had Henrietta been white and poor, it's likely the same situation would have happened. She would have ended up in a similar ward, because this is where poor people were treated. But I think by the 70s, had her family been white, they would have had a very different experience than Henrietta's kids did. I think that's actually the place where race played the most important part. And so in terms of access with scientists, the younger generation, I don't think that was the case, but I realized, and I had to sort of go back to Deborah and sort of eat crow at a certain point and say, she and I would bicker about this, and I'd say, of course a black writer could do this, and I had to go back to her and say, I understand what you mean. And this was my first experience of white privilege. I'd heard the phrase, I didn't feel very privileged. I didn't grow up with money. I worked a lot of jobs, went into a lot of debt to go to school, and I never thought of myself as being a privileged person. And that experience really changed my understanding of race in this country in a way that I think was essential for writing the book. And I think Deborah wanted me to understand that. She sort of needed me to get that in order for us to keep going.
Deborah was very wise in her own way.
Yeah.
In navigating the situation. And it becomes clear as you read the book that she sort of goes from feeling sort of victimized to realize that she's in the driver's seat.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. She was one of the most sort of powerful, wise women that I've ever met, and she was working with really restricted tools. She didn't have a basic grade school education. She couldn't really read, and she wanted so badly to learn. She would carry a dictionary around with her everywhere she went, and if somebody said something she didn't know, she'd just pull it out and look it up and stop the conversation and ask you to define a word for her. And I think there's one moment in the book where she, and I didn't know she'd been doing this, I sort of helped get her online at a certain point, which initially was like, a disaster, because then she spent all night sitting there Googling Henrietta Lacks and finding this crazy stuff and thinking she'd found clones, and like it just exploded. And she'd call me at 4 o'clock in the morning and be like, go to this website, I found the clones. And, but then once she'd sort of worked through that, and she started just on her own, she started kind of found a way to use the internet to help her get what she wanted. And there's this moment where we went to learn about her sister at this mental institution where she had died at 15. And Deborah wanted so badly to know what happened to her sister. And we went in there and started getting close to some answers, and someone came in and said, you can't have this. This is not, this is privileged information. These are not your medical records. And Deborah opens up her purse and she's like, power of attorney, and starts slamming these forms on the table. And which was amazing to see. She was like, no one is stopping me from this. And so through the time that we spent together, I think part of it from just seeing that the world was open to her, and scientists wanted to share information with her, and I think each little bit of information she got empowered her to go get more. We both were very, I think, transformed through the whole process in very different ways.
I want to go back to the dealing with the medical community in Hopkins. I imagine for them this was a teachable moment. Look back and reckon with decisions that had been made, and then figure out, how to move forward, how to own that, and then how to figure out how to make sure that something like that didn't happen again. Or to question, how are people treated when they walk in the door right now? Is everyone treated equally? Did the medical community, both the doctors and the administrative staff, acknowledge or admit to the role that class and most particularly race played in this story?
You mean at Hopkins?
Yes.
Yeah, Hopkins' role in all of this is very tough, because this is something that happened all over the country. This is something that happened all over the world. It worked at Hopkins. But people at this point in the 50s, when Henrietta went into the hospital, we didn't even have the phrase informed consent. It was absolutely standard to take samples from anybody and try to use them in research, or to do research on people without their consent. This was the era of the radiation experiments, where people were actually being exposed to radiation to see what would happen. It was a very different time.
And dealing with the wounds, sort of untreated and open. And,
yeah, and so, and when it came to Hopkins, they were doing a lot of this research in these public wards, which is where Black patients went because they couldn't go anywhere else, and it's also where poor patients went. So the majority of research at Hopkins and other places happened in these public wards, which no one sort of denied. There was this attitude at the time, well, you're getting free care, so in exchange, the least you can do is let us use you in research. And so that was it was a pretty standard thing at the time. And so for Hopkins, the fact that the cells worked and that they did grow put them in the spotlight as if they had been the ones doing this where everybody was doing it. So it really was standard at the time. Doesn't change the fact that it happened and all of that. But so that was the case with her cells being taken. And then when things get more complicated is later in the story, when they go back to her children and use them in research, when they release their medical records, and that was not standard practice. None of that was. And when the book came out 2 years ago, the week it came out, Hopkins they put out a press release. They said, yes, we took the cells without asking. That was standard practice at the time. We didn't profit directly off of them. George Guy gave them away for free, which is true. They have since grown, they grew into a multi-billion-dollar industry. The family can't afford health insurance. There's this big disparity that's at the heart of the story for the family. And Hopkins was like, we didn't profit off of them directly, which is also true. But then they didn't say anything about the other stuff, the using the kids, the release of the medical records, and I honestly think they just hadn't read the book yet, and they didn't know the full extent of the story. So then I showed up at Hopkins about a few weeks later on my book tour to talk to a writing class for like 35 students. And I get there and there's this long row of people waiting to talk to me, this long line of people in suits. And I'm like, hello, I'm the head of the Hopkins IRB. Hello, I'm the head of outreach for diversification in science. And all of the people who dealt with the real world implications of the story and really understood that there were so many problems with mistrust between the minority communities and medical research institutions, and how damaging that was. And so they saw this and they just said, we aren't okay with that response. And so it sort of started this groundswell within Hopkins to try and figure out, how can we reach out to the family and do something for them? How can we learn from this? How can we kind of reach out to the community and show that we're learning from this within what the lawyers will allow, which is we can't say we're sorry, we can't say we did anything wrong. So there's, it was, so, and so that was an amazing thing to watch. And, so one of the first things that happened is one person at Hopkins said, I'm going to make sure every freshman has to read this book. And sure enough, the next semester, every freshman had to read the book. And then, there was sort of, one group launched a scholarship for high school students in East Baltimore for, I think it's $40,000 a year to go to college in Henrietta's name. There's another one, another grant that's in her name for outreach between communities and research centers. And they just weren't able to do anything directly for the family because of this concern about setting a precedent and saying that they had done something wrong. And there was this concern about, if we give them money or do something that indicates that people are owed money in a case like this.
Admission of guilt.
Yeah, and then it opens these big floodgates and these questions of, what about the millions of other people out there whose cells are used in research, and what, who pays them? And it's a big issue. But then there's also a group within Hopkins who's been working really hard to make sure that her family can get medical care. So this is a real sore spot, obviously, in the story that, here's this woman whose cells have done so much for medicine, and her family couldn't go to the doctor. And in reality, they qualify for a lot of public, assistance through Hopkins. They can pretty much get care at Hopkins, just as anyone in their situation could. They just never could navigate the system and fill out the right forms, and they didn't know how to make it happen. So now they have this sort of designated team at Hopkins that helps them. And if one of them has to go to the doctor, okay, then someone's gonna go to their house with the right form, get it filled out, make sure they get to the doctor. Now. So now they have this team of advocates within Hopkins that make sure that they get care. And then, I started this Henrietta Lacks Foundation, which is mostly focused on education, but then we've also been able to help in, I realized, Henrietta's kids in their 70s and don't need education grants. What they needed was help in the situations where Hopkins couldn't get something covered, then we would step in and help with that. So together with Hopkins, we've been able to sort of piece together, I think, a pretty positive situation for the family.
Your dedication to the family is impressive.
Thank you.
And that's something that is very important to you.
Yeah, no, it is important to me, and it's something I, early on, as I started understanding where I fit into their story, I knew that I didn't want to be someone who came along and potentially benefited from all of this without doing something in return. Figuring out what to do in return is very complicated as a journalist, and you can't pay people for their stories because there's this whole sort of journalistic code of ethics that says you can't do that, and so then how do you? And so it took me a while to kind of figure out this education fund, which isn't just for the Lacks family. It's actually, the goal of it is to help people who made important, significant contributions to science without their knowledge and without benefit. So the descendants of the Tuskegee syphilis studies qualify. And so it's broader than that, but my goal was, obviously very much to be there for the Lacks family, to help them with things that Deborah felt was really important too. Education for her. She came to really believe that if she had had access to a basic education, so much of what happened would have been less traumatic and difficult for her and the rest of the family, that they would have been able to sort of ask questions and sort of be their own advocates in a way that they weren't able to be.
How is she doing now?
Well, so the family.
By the way, I should say that there was a member of the audience who tried to ask you that question earlier, and I had to.
Oh, yes.
No, we're
the
saving
family.
that.
Yeah. So the question of, I think the question earlier was like sort of what's my relationship with like with them now, and they're all. It's pretty amazing. When I finished writing the book, we had talked for a long time before the book was done about what was going to be in it and sort of what would it be like when it came out. I sort of had a very intense informed consent process with them because I wanted them to know, we could have just spent the last decade doing this and maybe no one's going to read it. Or maybe everyone's going to read it, and they're going to want to call you and say, like, I think I just saw Henrietta's clone walking down the street, or something. You know, people, strange things happen when stories get out to the world. And so I wanted to sort of prepare them for what might happen and say, you know, do you want your phone numbers to be unlisted? And how do you want the world to be able to reach out to you? And should we make sure you're unlisted? And so we sort of did all that. And they decided that they wanted to have a website where people could reach out to them. And there's an email address there, and they check it. They get stories from people all the time. You know, my mother's alive because of this drug your mother's cells helped develop. That they get a lot of that, and scientists reaching out to them. So we sort of went through that, and when the book came out, I think there was this feeling, I think, among a lot of people in the family that people weren't going to read it, and they weren't going to care because that had sort of been their experience. And then the book came out, and the younger generation was sort of watching, you know, Twitter and Facebook and blogs and going, people are reading it. People are definitely reading it. And the family would come to my events. They would sort of sit quietly in the audience, and every once in a while they would, you know, maybe answer questions or sign books. But they were pretty quiet about it, just sort of watching the public's response. And you know, I think through reading the book, it opened up a conversation within the family where they learned much more about the cells, and you know, the younger generation didn't even know what the cells had done for science. They didn't know anything about them. So I think it took a while for the family to sort of digest everything that was happening, and then they've started now, they go out and travel and talk on their own. So they're out on the road. Sonny, the middle son, is traveling just as much as I am at this point, visiting schools and giving lectures and answering questions and making probably, you know, a better living doing that than he's made driving his truck most of his life. And so we're in contact a lot in part through that of, you know, we're sort of very involved in, you know, we talk together sometimes, and, you know, and then we have barbecues if I'm in town, you know, so we're still very much in contact, both for, you know, because of the foundation, and just generally the sort of connection through the book. And for me, it's been amazing and wonderful to watch them sort of take their story back in the public, because so much of their story is about the fact that it was always being told, whether they wanted it out there or not. It was often wrong, and they didn't often even know what was being said, and they didn't feel like they had a voice in all of that. And I think now it's been great to sort of watch them all take charge and go out there and talk to the world. And the younger generation especially, they're doing a lot of traveling and talking to Henrietta's great-granddaughters especially. They spend a lot of time giving lectures and stuff.
You know, everyone who has encountered these cells, starting with Dr. Guy, has just been astonished at their resiliency. Why were these cells so strong?
In some ways we don't know. So we know a few things about them. One is that she had HPV, the virus that causes cervical cancer. She had 2 copies of it. And something about that interacted with her genes and her cells to create the cancer in the first place. And she also had syphilis, which can weaken your immune system and cause cancer cells to grow more rapidly. So there was something about the HPV and the syphilis that made her cancer grow and grow very intensely. But a lot of people had HPV and syphilis, especially in the 50s, and their cells didn't just grow. And so there was something about her cells, her tumor, that combined with those other factors made them as powerful as they were. And really no one sort of stopped to ask why. You know, at that point, scientists had been trying to grow human cells outside the body for decades, and it had never worked. They wanted to use them, you know, we didn't know what DNA was. They didn't know the difference between a cancer cell and a normal cell. They had all these scientific advances they wanted to use the cells for. So when they finally grew, no one was like, well, let's stop here and look and see, why did these cells grow? They just took off with them, and they're like, use them to create the polio vaccine, and we're gonna send them up into space to see what happens to human cells in zero gravity, and we're gonna clone them. You know, just the number of advances that they made using them in the first, even just 5 years, was just astonishing. And then the next generation of scientists came along, and HeLa cells were just always there. And, you know, it's like you get your test tubes and your lab mice and your HeLa cells and your fruit flies, and they never really stopped to ask, like, where did they come from and why are they there? And so it's only recently since the book came out, and, you know, this is one of the questions I get a lot. And I will talk in front of scientists often, and they'll say, like, we don't know that? Why don't we know that? Like, we know everything else about HeLa cells.
And is it knowable now? I mean,
Oh,
can
yeah.
you go back and actually?
Yeah, there's some scientists that have actually been doing some work where they've been looking at the genes and like what exactly, what within the cells did this, and made them immortal, and so now they're learning much more about it. Yeah.
How did you come up with the title?
It just always was. It's funny. I just
'Cause titles are difficult.
they are. Titles are really hard, and I worked on the book for quite a while before I was able to I eventually wrote a book proposal and got a contract for it. And I just put that title, it was just always in my head. I put it on the book proposal, it's just sort of always been there. And I think for me, it's because the story, as soon as I started understanding the story and what the family had been through, for me, so much of the story was, the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks, meaning like all of the things that happened after she died and the cells became immortal. The things that happened with her family because of her death, the things that happened with the science and the cells, and so for me, that idea of the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks and the sort of different tendrils and all the things that life reached was essential for the book.
Well, we have a microphone. It's hard for me to see
Yeah, we
because of
can't
this
see.
intense
There are
light
people in
out
this
here.
room, aren't there?
But there's a microphone in the audience, and it's back here, and we are going to start taking questions from the audience in just a minute. So, though I can't see it, if you can spot it out there, you might start to make your way to
We have a
it.
spotlight on it.
Excuse me. Henrietta Lack is immortalized also through this amazing photo that is on the cover of the book.
Yes.
And, of all the photos that you could have found of Henrietta Lack, she might have been sitting at the kitchen table. She might have been knitting. She might have been dancing. She might have been doing a number of things. But that sassy photo with her hand on her hip, you almost like let your backbone slip. I mean, she just, it's just amazing.
It is.
That this is the picture that you were able to find, and that is the picture that we all now associate with her.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And to me, the picture, I stared at this picture for so long before knowing anything about her. And then the more I learned about her, the more the picture made sense. And then I started seeing these elements in her in the photo that I was hearing in stories from other people. I mean, she was sassy, and she was a very strong woman, and, to have a picture of her in the kitchen, it probably would have only been of her in the kitchen with, all these people around that she was like, you go do this, and I gotta find you a girlfriend, and you gotta, she was just, that was who she was, and yeah, so I love it that this picture is the one that's somehow survived.
When you told this story, in many ways you have become a receptacle for other people's stories, particularly people whose stories are somehow tethered to Henrietta Lacks and her immortal HeLa cells. What has that been like for you? Tell me a little bit about that particular reaction to this book, because people, I travel a lot, and people are reading this book all over the country, and often you can see how clearly emotional they are when they're reading it, because it calls to mind someone that they love, someone perhaps that they've lost.
Yes, oh, absolutely. And this is something intellectually I knew that, there really isn't anyone out there who hasn't personally benefited from these cells, whether it's just because you got a vaccine or, you or someone you love was treated with a cancer medication that was made using her cells. Just two of the most common cancer medications, vincristine and tamoxifen. I'm sure we have a lot of people in this room who've either taken them or love someone who has. In vitro fertilization, started with the cell. How many people have been born using that and have children? Because the personal ways that HeLa cells affect people's lives are sort of endless. And there's a point where you reach in the story where you go, oh, that's me. And intellectually, I knew that when I was writing the book. I knew these cells, everyone has benefited from these, and but to actually hear people's responses and to hear people saying I was reading and then I got to page blank and I was like, oh my God, that's my mother who took that drug, or that's me. And the incredible emotions that come along with that, I don't think I could have possibly anticipated, and the family couldn't. And that's been the most incredible and I think most humbling thing for everyone who's been involved in the book is the emotions. I sometimes when the paperback came out, several people from my publishing house, we had a big event in New York where they did a launch of the book, and there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people there. And several people from my publishing house were sort of standing behind the book signing table. And they'd never done that before, because I'm always on the road by myself. And one of them, about 15 minutes into the signing, leaned over to me and was like, "Is it always like this?" And I said, "Yeah." And it sort of made me realize I hadn't really thought of it as a sort of bystander, but it's almost like speed therapy. People will come up and tell me these incredible stories, and there's often tears, and and it is so emotionally, it's an intense and sometimes draining thing to be the receptacle for all this information, but it also feels like a huge honor, because people will come up and share these very personal stories about their lives and how they now realize their lives were completely changed in some way or another because of these cells. And they often feel like they have to reach out to the family and tell them these stories, and they love it. I mean, the family reads every one of these emails. They print them out. They pass them around to the people who aren't online. And I think this has been a lot of what has been transformative for the family. I think this is why Sonny Lax went from being the guy who sometimes sat in the audience to being the guy who's out on the road talking to people, because he started hearing over and over these stories of people who wanted to say to him, "Thank you for what your mother did, and we're sorry this was hard for you, and here's how I benefited." And I feel like, it gives people a personal stake in what happened to the family in a way that I don't know many other stories where that's the case, where really everybody's got some connection to these cells. So it's amazing, and people send them to me by email. I have this enormous inbox, or email folder where I collect them, and someday I will do something with them, because they really are amazing. A father who says,
we're very interested in what you might do with them.
Yeah, the ones that I think are. I just got one recently from a father who he sent a picture of his daughter at her. Is it sixth grade graduation? Yeah, when you go on to middle school. And she had been treated at St. Jude's for a type of cancer that, they were like, she's not going to make it. And this was many years ago, and she was treated with a drug that Heal Cells helped develop. And he sent pictures of her at her graduation to me and the family. And that alone sort of makes all those 10 years worth it. The fact that this kid now she's been reading the book with her dad, and and now is like, I want to go study science. And that's just, I just feel like it's such a gift that I didn't necessarily see coming.
For those who study science, did you have that audience in mind as you were working on this? Young doctors who have been working with HeLa cells forever, but didn't really know much about the woman behind them. Were you thinking of them as you were working on this book? Because I've had a chance to talk to you a little bit about the time that you spend with medical students.
Yeah, I thought about sort of everyone, which is probably part of why it took so long to write. But, I had very clear people in mind when I was writing. I wanted Deborah to be able to read it, someone with no education, with no understanding of science, with an actual fear of science. I wanted her to be able to read it and understand it. And I wanted, a Nobel Prize winning scientist to be able to read it and not feel like I'd gotten it wrong or simplified it too much. And, and then somewhere in the middle, I had all these other people in mind. And so I used test readers as I was writing. I would write a portion of the manuscript, and I would send it to a bunch of people who sort of represented that spectrum. And on this end, I'd get, I skipped this part, and on the scientists, and so I sort of worked hard to incorporate everyone in it. And so I thought very, very clearly about older generation of scientists, and that this is a way to look back on their history and where they are now, and of, sort of current medical students to say, these are questions you're going to be dealing with now. Like, as you go out into the world, how do you communicate with your patients? People actually do care what happens with their cells, even though that's not generally a lesson that scientists have been taught. Some people don't care. Some people do. And then I also really thought about the younger generation of scientists. Young girls and boys who think science is really boring, and who don't necessarily get inspired by science. I mean, one of the things about this story is here you've got a black woman who did these incredible things for science, and there aren't that many black female role models for young women, to sort of be inspired by. there's all this cool kind of sci-fi sounding science, HeLa cells in space and the cloning and, fusing HeLa cells with mouse cells. And I was like, that's got little boys written all over it. They could really get into that.
Little girls too.
And little girls too, but yeah, no, absolutely. And so I had these sort of kids in mind of thinking, like, this is thinking about the future generation of scientists and getting them interested in it, but also thinking about some of the ethical questions at the same time.
And you're working on a children's version
Right,
of the book
yes.
now.
So I'm working on a kid's version of it now, which is like, some sort of mad, like if you'd said to me, will you write this book again? I would have been like, no, are you crazy? I don't, like typing the words HELA in a row, I was never gonna do that again. But, then I started thinking more and more about kids and, so much of the book is about science literacy and the importance of being able to understand science, and that starts when you're kids. And so, I'm writing. So I'm writing again.
Let's bring the audience in. Is there anybody, no one has rushed to the microphone yet, but is there anyone who is dying to ask Rebecca a question? This is your chance. Would you mind making your way to the microphone? You don't have to travel far. It's just
They're recording this for cameras.
And if you could do me a favor, as you make your way back, could you begin by giving us your name?
Sure. Thank you so much for being here. Your book is marvelous. My name is Janice Judson. I'm the Poli-Sci Department Chair at Hood College. And I have a question for you. It's not from a scientific community, but I'm interested in the notion of human rights and transitional justice. And I'm wondering what you think about the role of a public apology to the family. This issue has come up with, the Japanese-American internment and the Tuskegee recipients. Do you think that would be something that either Hopkins or someone could institutionalize and give a public apology?
I think that for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier, Hopkins will never issue an apology just because there's this concern about an admission of guilt. With Tuskegee and the internment camps, there's a very clear, this was not right. This was, even by sort of the norms of the time, this was not okay. And the issue of taking people's cells and using them in research is much grayer than that, because it was standard at the time, and it, so it's very complicated in terms of a public apology as like we did wrong because of this. But I do think, in a lot of ways, I think the family, I hate to speak for them in this kind of case, but I think it's probably safe to say that I think that a lot of what they've been experiencing with these letters from readers and scientists is that phenomenon. And I think that that's part of why they're right now feeling very positive about the the cells and the contribution the cells made, and they don't feel angry about the cells. They're still, they'd still like to get some money out of the whole thing from some pharmaceutical companies and stuff, but that's sort of a separate issue. Their anger has dissipated a lot, and they really view the cells as being a wonderful scientific milestone. And I think a lot of that is because of both the emails from the public saying this is how they've helped us, but also, the volumes of scientists who have emailed them saying, this is how I used HeLa cells in my research. I'm sorry that I never wondered, and I'm so glad that I know the story, and I'm sorry if this was hard for you, but this is why it was important for science that these cells existed. And I think for them that has been an apology in a sense.
Thank you.
Just before we take the next question, has there been a precedent with a pharmaceutical company paying someone whose cells have been collected?
No, not in this way. There have been cases where people were paid for their cells, but only when they realized they were valuable before they left their bodies. Okay. So there's one case in particular, this guy named Ted Slavin, who his doctor told him, you have this amazing thing in your cells that's worth a lot of money to the pharmaceutical industry. So he set up a company and, said...
And sold his own cells?
And sold his own cells. Mm-hmm. And he was a hemophiliac, and he couldn't work, and this ended up being the only way he could support himself. And at the same time, he really wanted, this had to do with hepatitis B research, and he really wanted someone to find a hepatitis B vaccine. So in addition to selling his cells for profit to pharmaceutical companies, he picked one researcher, this guy who had done a lot of important hepatitis B research and had won a Nobel Prize for it. And he said, you get me for free, like whatever you want. Use my body, use my cells, like do whatever you need to do, as long as you do it in a way that's going to find a vaccine. And they did. So this researcher did end up using this one guy's cells for free to find a hepatitis B vaccine, while the pharmaceutical companies supported the guy and did other research on his cells. But the key there was that he was able to set up those deals before any cells left his body. Once they've left the body, there's all sorts of legal precedents saying you don't have any control, you don't get any money, which is why there's been no move from any pharmaceutical companies to pay the family.
Another question.
It's an honor to meet you, ma'am.
Thank you.
In the beginning of the show, you thanked Henrietta. Can you talk about the voodoo aspects of the book? That's my favorite. I'm sorry. It's not
No, that's
fine.
fine. No,
Thank you
you're
for
not
your
alone in that.
question.
Yeah, so there is this sort of supernatural undercurrent through a lot of the book where, and Deborah and I, we would sort of joke about it, and there were some elements where, if something, if the weather was good, be like, oh, Henrietta's looking out for us, she's got the, but it really, Deborah very much believed that Henrietta's soul was alive in these cells and that she was brought back to life as an angel to take care of people with these cells and occasionally do things to people if they made her mad. And
Yeah.
and so she really came to believe that Henrietta had been kind of guiding me my whole life and working me as a puppet, basically, to make me write this book. And I'm not a person who I don't share her religious, background or beliefs. I am not a supernatural person. But as things went along in the course of writing the book, I got to the point where I was like, I can't really say that she's not out there doing things because some really weird things happen that you kind of can't, they're hard to explain.
Yeah, some bad stuff happened.
One of my favorites is that there was, during the course of the book publishing process, which was very long and complicated, at some point there was an editor who tried to make me take the family out of the book and just write a story about the cells. He has since seen the error in his ways. I actually one of my friends got an email from him saying, I have not failed to notice that the one thing that everyone seems to be responding in the book was the one thing I tried to make her take out. But so we got into this very long, more than a year sort of battle over this. And we just sort of could not agree on it. I wanted to take my book away from the publishing house. And then he was in a very mysterious, strange accident one day. And he's fine now, which is why I feel like I can tell his story. But the short version of the story is that he was in an accident that was very hard to sort of explain, and he got amnesia very temporarily. And he and I had just talked earlier that day and about this issue of what's going to happen with the cells and the book and the family. And he had this piece of paper on his desk that said at the top my name and the date we talked, and there were no notes. And then he was gone. He didn't come back to work. He was out of work for quite a while he was recovering, and so I called the publishing house, and they said, well, we can't do anything because we don't know what you guys talked about. And I said, well, we agreed that I was going to get out of my book contract because we... And so, and so eventually, and that's really what freed me from that publishing house and allowed me to go to another publishing house to write this book the way I wrote it. And so, when I told Deborah this story, she was like, you try to take the family out of the book, Henrietta will, And so there were moments like that where I was like, I can't really say what I think about that. And it's funny because every once in a while I'll have scientists in the audience stand up and say, were you ever able to straighten the family out on that whole her spirit's alive in the cells thing, and the cells. And I was like, well, can you prove that they're not? I mean, it's one of those things that it really depends on your personal beliefs and what you believe life is and how your DNA is connected to you personally. And and so for the Lax family, she very much is alive in those cells. And people often say, well, so do you believe she is? And my answer to that is well, my belief in the spiritual and supernatural world hasn't changed. It's not that I'm still very much a science person, but I'm also afraid to say that I don't believe it because I'm afraid she'll get mad at me. So there's obviously a little conflict there.
She became your friend in the end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't.
She became your friend in the end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The light is
Yeah.
blinding. Sorry. I'm Jody, and I've lived in Frederick County my entire life. And I think I was just wanting to ask you if you could, this book you've thought through so many different things, of the aspects of the scientist to the family to everything, but I'm being very selfish and wanting to know, living in this area my entire life and knowing about Hopkins, the most wonderful hospital in the US, you know, I'm just kind of thinking like how it impacted me personally, and what locally, what you had to do to research besides Hopkins. I mean, there was stuff about how some of the Black Americans came up through Virginia to Baltimore to make things. And there's so much I learned about in this book about myself and about the area that I live in. So I would like you to.
Yeah, thank you. And in terms of that, you know, the Great Migration, which is sort of what that is referring to, the migration of, you know, Black families from the South to the North. You know, Isabel Wilkerson has written a great book that's entirely about that. And so, yeah, this is something, if people are interested in that element of the story and the local connections to that, I would certainly recommend reading that book. And actually, there was a Frederick, unless I'm remembering wrong, the Microbiological Associates, which was the company that first sold HeLa cells. So it was the first for-profit company to ever sell any human biological materials. And it was set up in an old Frito-Lay factory. And it was actually, I'm not remembering if the original was in Frederick or if it moved to Frederick, but it was around here as well. And so yeah, I mean, there's so much amazing science history around here. I mean, you know, the number of research labs that are near here. I mean, there's a lot of important stuff here. And in terms of Hopkins, you know, Hopkins is an amazing place, and you know, I don't think there's anything in this book that detracts from the fact that it's, you know, it is one of the top hospitals in the country, and was at the time. And you know, sort of the amazing thing about Hopkins in that time period is that the kismet, and going back to this word you used earlier, of if Henrietta had lived somewhere else and hadn't gone into Hopkins at that moment, these cells probably wouldn't exist. The fact that Hopkins was where it was, the fact that they treated Black patients, the fact that George Guy was there doing this research at that exact time and she happened to walk in the room, all of those things had to happen for these cells to exist. And they existed because Hopkins was doing this cutting edge research on cervical cancer that, you know, is why we now know how to use the pap smear. And so they did so much important research having to do with these cells that had, you know, reached far beyond just the HeLa cells.
Thank you. Is there a HeLa tour?
You know, there's
I
not.
don't
Yeah,
mean
there
to
should be.
You know, I'm not trying to be trite in asking
No,
that
people
question,
actually
but
ask, yeah.
Sometimes when there's a best-selling book, if you remember Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, you could go to Savannah and there was a wonderful tour of the city.
Yeah.
Is there something similar?
You know, I mean, if Clover was more than a few buildings at this point, there might, you know, there's not a whole lot to see there, but people do definitely go on a pilgrimage to Clover, and there's stuff to see now. One of the things that's really unsettling for people in the book is that Henrietta was buried in an unmarked grave behind her family's house, and she now has a grave marker that was donated after the book came out, and so does Elsie, her daughter, and they're now in this field where they're buried and behind the house in Clover. So there's that to see. There's also now a historic landmark on the highway that sort of goes quickly by Clover that says this is where Henrietta was from. And then in Hopkins, you know, the George Guy's old lab, they've started taking some people in there every once in a while. It was a closet. I mean, it is now filled with files. And his lab was so tiny. And so, you know, I wouldn't be at all surprised if they, at some point, opened up and had some more interesting touring things there.
We've got some more questions. You're on.
Hi, my name is Pat, and I kind of represent the non-scientific, just enjoyed the book, and I'm glad you left the family in it person.
Thank you.
My book club is reading it for our book club this month, and a lot of us are here tonight. But one thing I wanted you to address was, how did you come back from that attack that Deborah did on you? That scared me reading it.
You and my dad, yeah. When he read the manuscript, he was like, I am so glad I didn't know you were doing this. Yeah, this actually goes back to the question you asked in the beginning of sort of what kept me going, really. You know, and Deborah, she would have these moments where she would sort of not trust me, but that was obviously a very big moment. And for those who haven't gotten that far in the book, that she really had this moment where we were in a hotel room by ourselves, where she thought that someone had sent me to steal her medical records, or she thought I was lying to her in some ways, and she physically just attacked me, threw me against a wall. And the amazing thing about that moment, I thought about it so much over the years. There's so many things happened in that moment. Deborah was incredibly wise and incredibly perceptive, and I was hiding something from her in a sense. So what she was worried about was that I was going to try and steal her mother's medical records. We were looking at them in that moment, and she said something about don't put this one thing in the book, and I just sort of grinned, and I wasn't hiding anything about what she thought I might have been hiding about. Like, oh, she's going to try to steal my mother's medical records. I think she had reached a point where she was like, there's no way that anyone can deal with the amount of, shit I've been throwing at you for the last however many years without getting mad, and you never get mad. Like, what are you hiding? Which was true. I would leave and go home and be like, she's making me crazy. It's like I would have my reactions to some of our, strife privately, but she'd never seen me react to it. And, and just instinctively, she was like, you're hiding something. And I was hiding my emotions from her because I was afraid to scare her away. And in that moment, when she threw me against the wall, I got really mad at her. And I pushed her off me, and I cried, get off me, we got a fight. And it was the first time we'd ever done that in at that point, it had been 7 years or something that we'd been doing this. And she just said, thank you, okay, you're a human. Why has it taken you this long? And it was very, in retrospect, what I realized is that she needed to see me get mad. She needed to see me being a regular person, because at that point, she needed to see the full spectrum of me, and I hadn't been letting that out. And I was like, if I knew that all I had to do was cuss at you, I would have done that years ago.
Years ago.
And then she said, but that wouldn't have worked. I would have gotten mad at you. So it was it had to happen at the right time.
Right.
And then everything changed after that moment. So that night it was terrifying, and it was, it was a really shocking moment. But then, the next morning, she showed up at my hotel room door and said, that's got to go in the book. She said, I understand that that's not about you. That's about what's happened to me over all these years with these cells. And I can't trust anyone. And this is part of the story, and we have to keep going. And she would say to me over and over again, no matter what I do, don't let me scare you away from writing this book. And so her ability to rebound in those moments and come back to me and say, and just be so coherent, sometimes more so than I was able to be at that moment, because I was still sort of what just happened?
Yeah, I was too.
That really helped me. That really helped keep me going, with sort of her resilience and her understanding of how that fit into her story. And then I also had a lot of other people who were, I would get very exhausted. This sort of goes back to your question. I've been working on this story for so long, and I felt like, isn't everybody sick of HeLa cells? This is all I've been thinking about for a decade now. And I go to, a dinner party or something and meet somebody, oh, what do you do? I'm a writer. What are you working on? I'd tell them the story, and they would just go what are you doing out of your house? Go home and finish writing this book, because I want to read it, which was very stressful as a writer, but it was really helpful too, because it was oh right, yes, I'm the only one who's been completely consumed with this. The rest of the world still doesn't know it. And so that really helped to sort of keep me going too, and to help me rebound from really hard moments. And the other thing, and then I'll stop, was actually scientists. As the word sort of got out in the scientific community that I was working on this book, and the older generation of scientists who had worked on HeLa cells at the start were dying. They were in their 80s and 90s, and a lot of their history was dying with them. And they didn't want it to. And so they heard about this person who was writing this book, and they would track me down and say, you haven't interviewed me. I have this great story, about, which is this gift as a reporter. And so this one day, I had this story that to me symbolizes so much about science, because science is all about sharing information with people so that you can all learn from it, in a sense. And this one day, I got a letter in the mail. I have no idea how this guy got my home address. And it was from a neurosurgeon, and he said, I've just been diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor. I will probably be dead by the time you get this, but I know you're working on this book, and I've been going through my archives so my kids don't have to, and I found this thing that I thought you'd be interested in. And it was a little two-sided, a little two-page thing, and it was a receipt from buying HeLa cells in the early 50s from this company, Microbiological Associates. And it had how much they cost, how they shipped them, who was selling them. And I had been looking for documentation of the for-profit side of helicells for years, and I couldn't find it. And that one document let me figure out the entire history of the business side of helicells because of the names and the dates and the dollar figures that were on it. And he was indeed dead by the time I got it. I tried to call him and he was gone. And so things like that would happen, and like, how do you stop at that point? I mean, I felt like I had so many people behind me saying, you've got to keep going, you've got to keep going.
That sounds like Henrietta had something.
Yeah. Yes, you're right.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Michelle. I work at a local biotech company. And I just wanted to preface my question by actually saying thank you as a scientist for telling this story. It's phenomenal what we don't know. I learned about helicells and cancer biology, and it was almost as much as you learned, which is they're cells from a woman, Helen Lane, which is also not correct. But it gives me an approachable way to give something to people who aren't scientists in my life and give some understanding of what I do for a living, even though it has nothing to do with helicells.
Yeah.
But it's still something tangible that they can go, oh, wow, there's a lot to be gained from science. And I'm thrilled to hear that you're writing a book for children, because I have 2 nephews who I don't get, but I feel like I need to give them something to give them some kind of exposure to options in life. But I needed to say that before I asked my question. It's for you personally. Okay. Do you see a life for yourself beyond this book?
You know, we were talking about that backstage. I'm trying really hard to see a life for myself beyond this book. It's very funny because, I started working on this book. I couldn't have imagined I was still going to be working on it now. I mean, the number of things in my life that I was like, when the book is done, I'm going to blank. And like, it still happened, I'm still consumed with the book. And so, and I got to the end of it, I was like, whew, the book is finally done. I can go on with my life. And then, here I am 2.5 years later, still completely consumed with helicells. I'm in this place where I'm trying to make a life for myself in that, and saying like, okay, at some point, I have to do other things, and but it's very hard when you get, a community and a school, and they're saying, we're all reading the book, and will you come talk? It's a very hard thing to not do, because I feel like it's part of the job of writing a book like this. People have questions, and they have all these emotions. They weren't there the decade that I was working on the book, and so I'm trying to sort of find a place where I can do both, which so far I haven't succeeded at, but I'm working on it. Yeah, and I have another book that I'm sort of starting to think about writing that has nothing to do with helicells. But for now, it's the kids edition. There's going to be a movie that I'm a consultant on, and so are members of the Lax family. It's being produced by, it's an HBO movie being produced by Oprah and Alan Ball, which is very exciting. But it's funny, and actually the Lax family, interestingly, they're like, you got to get on with your life. Like, you got to stop this. And the fact that they're now out there traveling and speaking about it has been a real liberation for me, in a sense, because I think, talk to them, not me. Like, I wrote the book, but like, this is their story, and if they're willing and able to go out and talk about it, it makes me feel much better about saying, you know what, I gotta let them go do that now. So I'm trying.
Thank you for your dedication to the story.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't, we were able to hear, good. We have a line of people who want to ask questions, so let's see if we can get through some of these quickly so we can hear from everyone.
Fast. I'm not good at that, as you may have noticed.
It's a little low, sorry. My name's Athena Richardson. I'm a senior at Hood, and you keep saying that Hopkins is not going to make a public apology because everyone was doing it at the time, and that's kind of ringing hollow for me as an African American studies minor, that that's not an acceptable excuse for injustice. So I'm wondering if anyone has come to you in the medical field or in a social justice field saying, thank you for writing this book, and I'm going to now move forward to correct this historically and for the future.
There's, a lot of people who have come forward, and, it's being taught in medical schools all around the country. It's being incorporated into hospitals, and, it's very much being used as a way to say, this happened, this is not okay, this is a history that we need to learn from and change going forward. So, by saying Hopkins isn't going to issue an official apology because of their concerns about, sort of legal issues, doesn't mean that the scientific community is just saying like, yeah, that's right. It's very much being embraced by the scientific community as a way to say, even just to learn how to communicate with patients more, and saying, yes, I've been dealing with, a lot of scientists know there's a huge mistrust between African Americans and the scientific community, and they don't really know the history of where that comes from. And I often hear from scientists saying, now I get it, and now I have a way to talk to them about it, and we have ways to talk about policies going forward. So absolutely, there's a lot of change coming from people understanding the story, including, there's actually a legal changes that are being talked about, and there's a revision to the laws having to do with tissue research that actually mentions Henrietta in the text of the law that says this is a case we need to pay attention to. So I definitely don't want to give you the impression that people aren't saying this is something that we need to learn from at all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
Is the family demanding an apology? Is
No.
it important to them?
No, yeah, the family's not demanding an apology at all. And in fact, one of the things that's interesting when they travel and talk about the book is people expect them to be very angry. And they're really feeling very positive right now, and they're not angry at all, and they're feeling like the response from the public is the thanks and the
Is the
apology that
balm
they need. Yeah.
that they need.
Yeah.
Question.
Hi, I'm MJ Swicegood, and I also go to Hood College. And I was wondering, in an ideal world, because you said how important HeLa cells are, they obviously are, how would you have seen the situation with Henrietta Lacks turn out? Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's a hard one. It's sort of, you're looking at a different era. So honestly, there's not much that could have been different in the 50s, when they took the cells. They didn't know anything that was going on there. They didn't know that there was DNA inside those cells, that they would someday be able to look at that and learn about her kids. And so I think the important thing is to look at where we are now. And there's a lot of discussion about that. There's a lot of tissue research being done to this day without consent. There are clear laws in place that say, if your name's attached to tissues or if it's taken just for research, that requires consent. But if it's taken for other reasons like biopsies or blood tests and your name's removed, that doesn't require consent. So there's still a lot of research being done without people realizing it. There's no requirement for disclosing money that might be involved. And so there are a lot of discussions about what to do about that. And I think that sort of the short version, since I know we're getting close to the end here, is that from what I hear from the public, what they want is disclosure. People get that this research is important. They want to donate cells and tissues, and they want science to succeed. They don't want it to happen without them knowing. And so I think really so much of it is about just telling patients what's going on and having clear consent for all tissue research.
Sounds like the science has gotten ahead of the law.
Mm-hmm.
Next question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Karam. I study biology at Hood College, and I was just wondering, in your book you talked a little bit about the strength of HeLa cells. Like you mentioned injections into people to see if the cancer would grow, and you mentioned contamination in other petri dishes, and I was wondering, could you briefly explain the potency of HeLa cells, like why they survive and others don't?
Yeah, I mean, we sort of touched on that earlier, and the short answer is that they still don't know. That's the thing I was talking about when I was saying she had HPV and syphilis, and so it's still a bit of a mystery why her cells are so much hardier than other cells, why they grow exactly the way they do. So hopefully that's something we'll know more about soon.
Okay. Is it simply that they outlive the healthy cells, or is it?
It's that they're sturdier, they're hardier, and as HeLa cells are used, like when you're learning to do tissue culture, those are the cells they use to teach students how to do cell culture, because they're the hardest ones to kill for the most part, and that they're the ones we know the most about. So they're tougher. They sort of consume all the food basically, and the other ones just kind of couldn't keep up, and it spread.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Jennifer Candy. I'm a recent biology graduate of Hood College. I'm going to start a PhD program in the fall. And this scene that spoke most to me was when you took Deborah and Zachariah to Dr. Christoph, can't remember his last name's lab. It was just very beautifully done. And I just wanted to know more about what your feelings were on that scene, because you seem to focus more on the family there and and the doctor just letting them have their moment, and just what a beautiful thing that must have been to see them finally seem to get some validation from science.
Yeah, no, absolutely it was. And throughout the book, I mean, I felt like my role was to stay out of the story unless it was something that was, relevant to their story. It was an incredible moment to watch for so many reasons. And one of them was just Christoph, his last name is Lengauer. This is one of those amazing things about writing nonfiction, is that the stories sometimes keep going. And, when I started working on the book, I'd never heard of him. He didn't exist in the story. And he just sort of appeared out of nowhere, sent me an email one day after I'd written a short article about the family, and he just, said, I want to reach out to them and do something for them. And just that little moment, changed so much about the story. He was the first scientist who reached out to them and just basically answered the questions that they'd had their whole lives, really, that no one had stopped to answer for them. And the thing that was so incredible to me was to watch how, it was like Bruce Springsteen had just walked into his lab. Like, he was so starstruck by them and so excited to be able to teach them about these cells and to talk to them. And they were sort of equally excited about seeing the cells. And it was a moment that, it has these very somber moments. There's some real emotion there, but everybody was really giddy. There was just like, everybody's like, oh, this is, and that was really incredible to watch, to see the joy in that moment. That could have been a really sad or scary moment, or a moment filled with anger. It just wasn't. It was just all about sort of joy, that was a wonderful feeling.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm George Dodge, and I want to thank you for your book. I haven't read it. I'm going to after this, but I haven't read it. But I do want to thank you. I work in a fantastic office that oversees medical research, and I'm a community member for Hood, and I was just wondering, would you ever consider joining an IRB after doing your research and sitting on a board to oversee research studies?
It's interesting. I've been approached a couple times about being on different boards, and this is something that as a journalist is very tricky, because part of being able to write about science and about ethics is not having anything that could be perceived as a conflict of interest, and to not be someone who, in the book, people often ask, I think, as someone did, what would I like to see different? And I think actually my job as a journalist is to not say, this is what I think needs to happen, but to say, here's all the different sides of the stories. You probably feel very differently than someone else in this audience about what needs to happen. And I think my job is to facilitate a discussion where people who have lots of different points of view can all benefit from hearing all the different sides to decide how they feel. And so for me, being on an IRB would be a very complicated thing, because my job as a journalist is to, the way I see it, is to not dictate any sort of decisions, and I would probably be sitting there being like, I need to write about all of this, and then that would be a conflict, and it would just be, it would be very difficult to do. So I feel like my contribution to the IRB world is writing about things that get the IRBs talking, as opposed to actually going and helping them make decisions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Rebecca, you mentioned that there's going to be a movie.
Yes.
And you had also said that your job is to remain in the background, but I can't imagine that they would make a movie without a character named Rebecca.
That's right, yes.
So who would play you in this film?
That's one of the big, that's one of the big questions right now. And it's very funny because, yes, in the book, I worked really hard to, I didn't want to be in the book at all. I was like, it's not about me, this is them. And at a certain point, I sort of realized I had become a character in their story and I had to be in it. And that's a whole other story. But I was very, very cognizant of not putting myself into the story. So you don't really learn anything about me as a character beyond what you see that's related to their story. And that doesn't work for a movie. And so, the people writing the screenplay and doing this stuff, that came to me at one point and they were like, so, this is great. We've got like the whole story here in the book. All the characters are really three-dimensional, but we need you. And so now, weirdly, the whole process of putting the screenplay together has been flesh out Rebecca Skloot, the character. And so, the screenwriter would come to my house and, like, interview me about what my life was like during that time and what was going on. Like, so there is this sentence here where you mention a divorce, and so it's been really interesting to sort of be on the other side of that equation and to now be the focus of, those questions. And I feel like it's only fair. That's always been my attitude, like with the Lax family when they wanted to know things about me. Is like, well, I was asking you these questions and expecting you to answer them, and so it's only fair that I do the same. But they've been, so that's been an amazing process. And so far, there's no casting has happened, but
Because I was going to come back and I didn't hear you answer that question.
yeah, no casting has happened. And there's, this is like one of the favorite games for everyone to play, the who's going to play me thing. And what's funny is people are always like, Julia Roberts, because she's got, brown hair and a big smile. But, she's too old. I was like in my, I'm too old too. I was in my mid-20s, I was like a baby. And so now, and it's like, so now there's, so all of a sudden I've realized, like, oh, right, this is a young version of me that's going to be in the movie. It's not me now, it's me then. And so so now there's, who knows who's going to play me or who's going to play
Who would you
anyone
like
else.
to play you?
I don't know who I want to play me. It sort of varies. I'll see a movie and I'll be like, oh, that person can play me. One person who gets tossed around periodically is Rebecca Hall, who was in The Town.
Oh, yeah.
She's right. She's great, and that could work. And it's a weird game to play. Like, you never imagine you're going to play the who's going to play me in a movie game. And so, for a while, people were saying Natalie Portman for a while, which is kind of cool because she's a science nerd. She has her undergraduate degree was in science, but then she got all, big with the, winning Academy Award, and so now maybe not. Maybe they couldn't get her, but who knows. So, I really don't. Somebody the other day mentioned someone that I got all excited about, and now I'm blanking on it, which is probably not good. But yeah, right.
There you go.
I will probably have a cameo, like I'll walk on and be a waitress in a bar or something, but I have no desire to play myself, Though I do want my boyfriend's an actor and a director, so I'm like, I want him to play, like, Christoph, or I want to play and I think my husband may end up being a character, so I'm like, oh, that would be hilarious, make my boyfriend play my husband, my ex-husband.
Your ex-husband.
Who knows? My ex-husband, yes, so, who knows? Which my ex-husband, we're in very good terms. He would think that was hilarious. But, so we'll see. I have no idea.
Rebecca, do you feel this has been a wonderful evening?
Thank you.
Is there an epilogue that you feel like you need to write based on your experiences now?
Yeah, probably. There are several different ones, I think. That in my head I think about writing. I certainly think about doing something just to share the stories, that people have shared with me about HeLa cells. But honestly, I think if anything, and I don't know how I would write this or when I would write this, but or if I would write it, but the two things that I keep coming back to as things I would love to write about somehow are just the things that I have learned about race in this country through writing the book and then publishing the book. We could spend another several hours here talking about that. And, being a white writer and writing a story that's, is a black story in a lot of senses, and, the relationship that I developed with the family surrounding that, and then sort of having it go out to the world at large, and the conversations that I've had in rooms like this, the questions that people ask are amazing, and they've really kind of, they've been very transformative.
Do you eavesdrop on people when you catch them reading your book? If they're talking
I bet the
about it?
women who were sitting next to me at that coffee shop today are wondering. There was a group of women. Are you guys in here? Where are you? I was sitting outside of a coffee shop before coming here and having a cup of coffee, and a group of women who were getting larger, growing. There's like more of them kept coming and coming. We're all coming here and talking about it. And they started to actually talk about the book, and I got up and I went inside because I knew they would come here and see who, but I also didn't want to be like, hi, I'm me. So no, I wasn't eavesdropping. And, but yeah, like in a situation, there have been times where I have been sort of out in public, and there was one, and actually this goes to the other story that I'm interested in writing about, which is the impact of public sudden public, I don't know what success, and this sort of how it can completely take over your life in a way that nobody can possibly understand or expect until it actually happens. And it's like there's this secret society of people who've experienced it. And when my book came out, it literally was just overnight. And I had no exaggeration. In like 2 days, I got over 15,000 emails in my just regular inbox, and that was the end of my inbox. And it's just like those kinds of things that you don't expect. And then everyone in the world wanted me to come speak, and and I was in the middle of this tour, and it just takes a while to figure out how to do that. And it was this incredible moment where a lot of other writers who had been there and had been through that moment when something exploded just reached out to me, and they were like, "Oh, I bet your life's a mess right now, isn't it?" and then said, "Here's what I learned and what I wish someone would have told me when this happened to me." And so there was this incredibly supportive world of writers who sort of reached out to me, and so then I've now done the same when I've seen this happen to other writers who I've known. And unfortunately, you don't know what's going to happen until it's happened, and then it's kind of too late, but you can still learn from it. But so I've really wanted to write about that experience, and of the public response and just how adjusting to that can be such an intense experience. I was going somewhere with the
epilogue.
Epilogue, and then writing of it. No, it's but the eavesdropping. It's gone. But yeah, no, it's gone. That's a drag. Because it was going to be a really good story.
It was like about
eavesdropping.
We've come to the end of our evening. Rebecca, it has been such a pleasure to talk to you. Whatever you write next, we will be looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think Rebecca will be outside signing books.
Thank you.
And hearing stories.
Yes, I'll be. And I just have to say thank you to Michelle Norris, who is amazing and has written an amazing book herself that you should all read.
Thank you.